All right, so let's talk about psychology BC, where the BC stands for before cognitive psychology, before the great topic in the world showed up. You can tell I am full bore a cognitive psychologist, so I will be as biased as I need to be as I describe the greatness of the founding of cognitive psychology. Okay, so what came before? Well, before any psychology came along, we had philosophy. And so this is going to be true for any field that you might be going into in psychology. Philosophy was the founding source of that. Epistemology is a subset of philosophy that is interested in the nature of knowledge. So, in particular, cognitive psychology was influenced by those philosophers that were really seeking out the nature of knowledge, that were trying to figure out how do we know things, what does it look like when we know something versus when we don't know something, things like that. This area of philosophy was first developed by Aristotle, and of course, he had followers that to this day are still talking about the nature of knowledge. British empiricism is another really important part of philosophy that I have to make a nod to. They made the argument that all knowledge must be acquired through experience. So the word empiricism means to only really trust your eyes and your ears and your direct experience. Don't you can be led astray by your logic. You can be led astray by other people's testimonies about what they saw or experienced. Only trust those things that you've acquired through experience. And they say that all experience comes through the senses. So they say you can only really trust your own eyes and ears and nose. And they usually leave out taste and touch. I think those are trickier ones to talk about. But so they say, you should only trust your own experience, and your experience is only that which comes in through the senses. And what they're trying to get at was don't rely on pure logic, don't rely on pure reason. Let the environment tell you. And they're the ones who came up with the concept of associationism. Now, they talked about it a little bit differently than psychologists do because they went right to ideas. And psychology was looking at behaviors. But they went right to ideas and talked about how complex ideas come from associations that we make between our sensations. We go from very simple reactions, maybe reflexes, to more complex ideas by making associations among the different kinds of sensations that we've had. So when we have a car horn blares and we jump, and then we have, let's say, I don't know, screeching tires, and we jump, we start to put all together that maybe we make associations between all those things, and we think maybe what's going on is that the person is realizing sounds that indicate they might be about to be struck by a vehicle causes this reaction, right? They're having these more complex ideas. I might be getting hit by a car, might be the idea that they're having. I don't think Aristotle made that argument, but since they didn't have cars back then in 2000 BC. But complex ideas, the British empiricists said, and these guys, by the way, were operating in the 1700s, 1800s, something like that, that we make these associations between independent sensations and independent experiences that we've had. We bring them together and make sense of the world through these more complex ideas. And they said that there are certain rules that govern the kinds of associations that we're going to make. They called the first one temporal contiguity. And what that's saying is that if two things happen close in time, so if like one thing right after another, we make an association between those two things and assume that they're related to each other. If they are similar to each other, we assume that they're related. If they're very different from each other, that may cause us to think that they're somehow related. If you have a stimulus that starts out white and then it changes to black, we may think, oh, something happened that caused it to change to black, rather than these are two independent stimuli that I'm looking at. And one just disappeared and the other one just appeared simultaneously. That was just a coincidence that happened simultaneously, rather than what we really would think, which is when it changed colors. So these kinds of they described a bunch of different principles that guide this kind of association that we make, and described the circumstances under which we tend to make these kinds of associations. And so that really was, you can imagine as we go on through the class, you'll be able to see a lot of things that clearly came out of British empiricism. The main philosophers in this field were Hobbes, Locke, Hume. That says Berkeley at the bottom, but he was English, so it was pronounced Barclay. And actually, that's the Barclay that UC Berkeley is named after. So we're all pronouncing that wrong, but at least we're Americanizing it, I guess. So British empiricism, saying that we need to acquire all information, all knowledge through the experiences, and then that comes through our senses, is going to be the precursor to really scientific reasoning, where we say, okay, not only does it need to come through our senses, but we need to be systematic about that. So that's sort of the factors that philosophy brought to us. Now, the first, how do I want to say this, sort of philosophical idea that was studied really systematically, scientifically, was later deemed a school of thought called structuralism. So, structuralism actually was the first real field in psychology, but it emerged so smoothly out of philosophy that it took a decade or so for people to start figuring out this is actually a new way of approaching problems, right? And talking about these issues. But so structuralism, the field itself focused on the nature of sensation. So you had those British empiricists saying that all information needs to come in through the senses. Structuralists were trying to figure out what is the nature of the different sensations, right? So they were really interested in pain and, I don't know, fear and, all these kinds of physical and, mood-based factors. Their goal was to try and figure out what the basic elements of consciousness really was. Like, what could we break these experiences down into? What are the elements that make up fear? What are the elements that make up joy? What are the elements that make up boredom? Right? Like, what little pieces go together, and which things are unique to each of these experiences, right? Because there's a lot of things that probably overlap in our behaviors or our thoughts or our reactions or our facial expressions. There are probably a lot of things that overlap between those examples I gave. But what the structuralists were really trying to figure out is which ones are different and what really makes joy different from fear and things like that. Wundt was the researcher who started actually trying to examine consciousness from a structuralist approach. His student, Titchener, is the one who came up with the idea of calling it structuralism. So Wundt just called it, I'm doing research, and Titchener said, this is a school of thought called structuralism. So structuralism was the founding father of really psychology in general. Wundt is attributed as the founding father of psychology. Their method that they used for studying consciousness was a technique called introspection. Now, just to make sure that you understand that they were trying as much as they could to be as systematic and controlled as they could be, as they were doing something very unsystematic and very uncontrolled. What they did was they recruited what ended up being a total of like 500 trained subjects, and they taught them how to verbalize their experiences, which is tough. I mean, if you've ever seen somebody who just had something really startling, it could be a happy startle, like, oh, a surprise, right? I didn't know this was going to happen and I'm happy it happened. Or a person who had something bad happen and they're upset about that badness that happened. If you've ever seen them interviewed on TV and the interviewer says, how are you feeling right now? A lot of times they say, I really don't know. There are no words. I'm in shock. They say things like that. It's unbelievable. If you've ever watched a reveal on one of these like real estate shows where they, remodel somebody's house and then they show them their reveal, a lot of times they keep just saying, oh, wow. Oh, my gosh. Oh, I can't believe it. They have really no words. They don't know how to express what they're they're feeling. And that's very typical for us humans. We really don't know how to explain what's happening inside of us. And so, what Wundt did is trained participants to be able to explain what they were experiencing in very specific language. He taught them specific words to use to describe certain sensations that they might be getting in their body or thoughts that might be crossing their head. So he trained them. He did all of the research in a very stimulus free environment, so he had control over all the sounds that they might experience, all the lighting, all the smells, the temperature, the anything that you can think of that might impact or interfere with the sensation that they were experiencing. And then the subjects described whatever sensations they were experiencing as a result of the stimuli that Wundt was producing. So they tried as hard as they could to be as controlled as they could be, but I mean, really honestly, the results were very unreliable. Different participants would describe the exact same stimulus very differently. And it's either possible that every stimulus is perceived in a very idiosyncratic way, or no matter how much you try and train people, they are not going to end up using the same words to describe the same thing. And so everybody basically has come to the conclusion that Wundt's conclusions are very unreliable and probably not valid, probably not that meaningful. But we have to give the guy credit for being the first one to say, let's try and figure out a way to get control over things so that we can be very systematic in our empirical study of, in this case, consciousness. So we got to give him credit. That's why he's given credit for being father of psychology, because he was trying to use the scientific method. So everybody and their brother was going to do research with Wundt. And I say brother on purpose because, of course, back in these days, Wundt started his research in in the 1880s. By 1889, he had his lab in place and started to gain notoriety. So by 1890, people were starting to come and do research with him. And back then, it was exclusively males that were coming to do research with him. He was in Leipzig, Germany, and there were a lot of American students who would go and study under him and learn his methodology, learn the questions he was asking, those kinds of things, and then come back to the United States and study those questions through their own lens. And one American who did that ultimately ended up founding the school of thought called functionalism. In this school of thought, and this was it, we credit this with being founded in like 1890, so very similar time frame as Wundt's research. And it was William James who had gone and studied with Wundt, and he said, you know what, instead of focusing on the elements that make up our consciousness, I'm going to study the function of our different conscious capabilities. I'm going to try and figure out what benefit comes to us from being able to speak. What benefit comes to us from having a good or bad memory? What benefit, right? Like, how does this allow our species to survive? Is what he was basically trying to figure out. So, his basic perspective was very associationistic, right? Where he was looking at the process of the conscious capability rather than the content of that. So he's going to be a little bit less concerned about what words you generate in response, but it just that you generate them, or the structure of what you generate, or the pace, or something like that. He was much more focused on the process rather than what you actually say, right? He's going to be more interested in how memory works than what exact words or stimuli you're able to remember. He was interested in the process. Now, in functionalism, they wanted to get away from introspection. After going and studying with Wundt, James came back very concerned about introspection and said, I don't think that's our road to, a scientific approach to this question. And so all the functionalists focused on observable behavior. Now, some of these observable behaviors are, like I've been saying, in all of these lectures, really inferences about stuff that's going on inside the head. So they might use paper and pencil tests. We have a lot of paper and pencil tests today that are like the grandchildren of paper and pencil tests that they used back then. We have personality inventories, and we have, mood, measures of mood, and we have, you know, memory tests and all sorts of things that can be done with paper and pencil. And what that means is that you as the participant take what's inside of your head and you put it on this paper by answering the questions that we've posed, right? In whatever structure we pose them. So paper and pencil tests were developed by the functionalists. Functionalists were they had a very evolutionary perspective. James and his sort of age cohorts had been influenced not just by Wundt, but also by Charles Darwin, having just recently published On the Origin of Species. And so they really bought into the idea that, you know, animals that are, to use their terminology, lower on the evolutionary hierarchy are like humans without the like social demands or the expectations or the inhibitions or other things that might interfere with a human behaving naturally. So they're like, why don't we take out all of that confusion and confounding and stuff that these things introduce, and just lower animals who don't have those things. And so they thought it was completely legitimate to study flatworms in place of humans. They're like, well, it has one giant neuron. We'll just study this, and this will stand in for how our brains probably react to something. Or let's study rabbits, or let's study rats. And so you see a lot of animal studies that started in functionalism and then will persist on for another 50 years. So the basic rationale for why they studied animals was because they really believed the evolutionary argument that if you have a lower animal behaving this way, this is probably, at least at the fundamental basic level, this is probably how humans behave also. So the most famous people probably in functionalism would be William James, like I mentioned, and then there's Dewey, there's Engel. There were a number of early researchers in functionalism, and most of them were doing their work here in the U.S. So Europe sort of stuck with structuralism for a lot longer than the US did. And, these researchers who went and studied with Wundt came back and said, we like your goal, like trying to understand human behavior from an objective standpoint. We just don't like your methodology, and so let's come up with something else. All right, behaviorism. Our last step before we will finally meet cognitive psychology. So behaviorism is definitely a direct parent of cognitive psychology. In behaviorism, they said that psychology must confine itself to observable variables. And the observable variables were the stimuli that would be produced by the researchers, and then the responses that would be produced by the learners. And that's it. We know what the stimulus was, and we see what the response is, and that's it. We can't talk about what's happening inside the black box. We can't talk about mental processes. We can't talk about sensations even, because we can't follow what's going on in the sensory organs. We certainly can't talk about perception. We can't talk about any of that stuff. This field was known as SR psychology, short for stimulus response. So this field of psychology was really focused on just these areas. So if you imagine the stimulus being some kind of event, they oftentimes would call it a predictor instead of stimulus, leads to behavior. And the R in SR stands for that as response. So SR psychology was in charge of psychology from like 1920 to about 1970. Cognitive psychology came on the scene a little earlier, but than 1970. But behaviorism really was, people were really invested in it, and researchers had all their research program attached to it and stuff. So it was really hard to make the shift any earlier than like 1970. And a lot of people were still behaviorists in the 1980s, and honestly, today there are still a lot of labs that are dedicated to very behavioristic questions. So it's not like behaviorism has died. It just is not as popular. The first person we'll credit with behaviorism would be John Watson. Around 1920, he started making the argument that really we need to only talk about that which we can directly observe. And that as long as psychology is asking people to do introspection or is asking people to, answer questions on a paper and pencil test, we're always going to have faulty and unreliable results. Sorry. And so Watson made the argument, let's just look at that which is directly observable. We can talk, we're really mixing up any conclusions that can legitimately be drawn when we try to infer what's going on inside somebody's head. And so behaviorism took off. It was very concrete, right? Like behaviorism used a lot of animals for research, so it was very I just want the word I keep thinking is very doable, right? Because you, as the researcher, have control over everything. You can even order from, medical sources animals that have the exact same DNA. So you could like even control, they're all basically identical twins. You can control everything. You can control the light that they experience, the food that they experience, whether they were raised to whatever age with their mom in the cage or not. Like you could control everything with especially animals like rats and things that could be kept in a cage. And so researchers are, flatworms for sure, right? So you can imagine there's some who spent their entire career studying fruit flies who have 24-hour lifespans. So you can imagine that researchers are like, wow, this is very look at the science I'm doing. This is very scientific and very controlled and so precise. And they may have unfortunately kind of forgot about the one big aspect of science, which is that it should be meaningful, that maybe it should be helpful to people. And so they were studying some big basic things, and then they started studying sort of little tiny aspects of those big basic things. And that's when it started to lose some of its traction in psychology, when people started going, who really cares whether a rat responds to reinforcement differently if the light is green versus teal? I mean, does it really, what are we doing? And so, you can imagine why researchers were attracted to it, and you can also imagine why, like, maybe newer researchers started to say, I don't know if I want to spend my career studying stuff like that. So, behaviorism took two major forms. Radical behaviorism, which is not only trying to figure out which stimuli produce which responses, which is basically predicting behavior, right? If I honk the horn, you'll jump, right? Like I'm going to predict that you're going to jump because I'm about to honk the horn, right? That's prediction. But they also wanted to learn to control behavior. Radical behaviorists were really like, okay, the reason why we're doing this research is if we can figure out what predicts behavior, then we can ultimately use that to control behavior. So they did their research by observing, the stimuli and then the behaviors that came from those stimuli. So environmental events, stimuli, and then the consequent behaviors or responses. They really didn't have an overarching theory that was driving radical behaviorism. They instead were like, you know what? We're scientists. We're just going to see where the data takes us. This is, letting the empirical evidence guide their data collection. Like as they find one thing in their research, that drives them to pose a new question. It isn't like they have a giant research program with a goal. And so Skinner was I'll say the founding father of radical behaviorism. And he wrote a book called Walden 2. And if you read that book, his goal was to figure out how to control people's behavior and get them to do stuff. And you see that in modern marketing and in modern, like sort of governmental things where they try and get people to do what is deemed to be the right thing through the use of laws or through the use of reinforcements or through the use of celebrities as promotional people or other kinds of things. They use a lot of these radical behavioristic principles to direct the population to do what is deemed to be the desirable behavior. So we will give you this stimulus and it will control your behavior towards the behavior that we want. So radical behaviorism is an offshoot of just regular behaviorism, where regular behaviorism was just trying to figure out what behaviors come from what stimuli. So radical behaviorism is a subset. So in behaviorism, the basic principle is that reinforcement, in radical behaviorism, I mean, reinforcement will lead to learning, right? So if I reinforce you for desirable behaviors, you will display those desirable behaviors more often in the future. Now, learning, the term learning is defined as a relatively permanent change in behavior as a function of experience. And so in reinforcement, we're going to try and elicit a relatively permanent change in the learner's behavior as a function of this reinforcement protocol. So radical behaviorism is over there on the one side, and we're going to try and control your behavior through the use of reinforcements. Methodological behaviorism, or what they call neurobehaviorism, those are two different terms for the same basic perspective. Oh, you're going to see a little bit of cognition in this definition, aren't you? Behavior changes due to learning inside the organism, not simply reinforcement. So researchers in the late 50s started to notice sometimes the learner, absent of any kind of reinforcement, changes their behavior. What's going on there, right? And these theorists said, I think that they are experiencing some kind of learning inside themselves that has nothing to do with the direct stimuli that we're providing. And it's changing their behavior from the inside. So beginning of a little bit of cognition going on here. Spence, a researcher in the 1950s, said that learning is when there's an intervening variable that's occurring inside the organism. So Spence was the first one to say that there's this thing called learning that is inside, that we can't necessarily directly observe the learning that's happening. And we can't necessarily take credit for the learning because we gave some kind of reinforcement and it changed their behavior. Their behavior might have changed independent of a reinforcement. There might be something going on inside of them that makes them decide to behave differently. And Spence called that an intervening variable. Hull, on the other hand, who was around at the same time as Spence, said that learning was a hypothetical construct. Ooh, nice. We're going to start to say that there's something going on that inside the organism's mind, right? That we as observers have to just consider it hypothetical until we can figure out what exactly it is. But in the organism's mind, there's something that has changed as a function of learning. And we can attribute characteristics to that hypothetical construct. We can say that this hypothetical construct will help us to explain behavior better than strictly stimulus. Right? So this is a real divergence from original behaviorism and certainly from radical behaviorism. The idea that there's something going on inside the organism's mind that, while it is hypothetical, us researchers can start to attribute characteristics to it. Like it might be goal-oriented. For example, this learning that's happening inside the organism's mind, it might be goal-oriented. It might be intrinsic. It might be something that learner was born with. It might be the sum of all the reinforcements that have happened in the past, and this is the conclusion that the learner has drawn from that sum. There are a lot of different explanations for what's going on with learning. But Hull was the first one to say, it's real to the organism. It's something meaningful to the organism. And that is the first nod towards what is going to become the field of cognitive psychology. So let's go ahead and take a break here, and we will come back with the glorious dawning of cognitive psychology.